Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar from the Trumpeter Swan Society, and this time in partnership with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and Trumpeting the Cause for Wetlands, the Iowa Swan Story. A couple of housekeeping details. Today's webinar is being recorded. You as a participant are muted and your video is turned off. But we do welcome your questions, and we hope that you will have some, and submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom section of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end. And everybody asked about the recording, and yes, in a couple of days, I will send out the recording once I upload it to our YouTube channel. And at the end, as you're closing your browser, there is going to be a survey, which is really important for us. So if you would fill those out, it's really easy and really valuable for us to get your feedback. Before I introduce people, I want to tell you a little bit about what the Trumpeter Swan Society does. We have several programs. One of them is restoration and management. And out west in Oregon, we're actually working with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Wildlife Service on restoring trumpeter swans to the state. And we're working with the zoos on that. We're also a partner in the Interior Population Management Plan, which is really a plan to help manage the population of swans pretty much east of the Rockies. We are also involved in education, and this is one of our education projects, which is webinars, but we also have some education books that we've created that meet next generation science standards for kids, and you'll see a little bit more about that in the presentation. And we also have a film project that is just now being carried on PBS stations, and it's called Return of the Trumpeters. And finally, we have a program called Trumpeter Watch, and some of you who are attending may have submitted Trumpeter Watch reports, and I send those to the people who banded the swans, and Anna will be talking a little bit about the GPS swan tracking study in Iowa, and so she's received Trumpeter Watch reports, as has Dave Hoffman, who's also on this webinar. They've received reports that I've gotten of the GPS swans from Iowa. So now I'd like to introduce some of the people to you. Jim Hawkins is on our board of directors. He is from the Yukon, and he will be asking the questions that you submit at the end. Thank you, Jim. And our presenters today are Anna Buckardt Thomas, Ron Andrews, and Dave Hoffman. So Ron Andrews is actually the person who started the Iowa Restoration Program, and he'll be talking about that. And Dave Hoffman followed Ron once Ron retired. And in our new film, Return of the Trumpeters, actually Ron and Dave have starring roles in that. And Anna Buckardt Thomas is, as I had mentioned before, was the lead person in the Midwest Swan Tracking Study for Iowa. So she'll be talking about that. So I am going to hand it over now to Anna and the rest of the presenters.
Okay, Ron Andrews here, and I'd like to thank Margaret and the Trumpeter Swan Society for this opportunity to present the Iowa Trumpeter Swan Restoration Program and Promotion of Wetlands in a webinar fashion. And the first slide basically just emphasize trumpeting the cause for wetlands. These birds are pretty active there on the waterfront, and Joe Johnson coined the term charismatic megafauna. I think that really describes trumpeter swans in terms of their size, their vocalization, and all that. Next slide, please. Yeah, here's Iowa, the center part of the U.S., kind of in the heart. We got Minnesota above us, Wisconsin northeast. If you go on down the line, we talk a little bit later to the south, well, first Missouri, but we're going to actually talk about Arkansas connections. And so that'll be a portion of this presentation as well. Next slide. Okay, what about the trumpeter swan? North America's heaviest native bird. Males average 26 pounds, although I do hear a few that actually go to 35 pounds of weight. That is a big bird to be flying around out there. They do need a runway when they take off. They got to get them feet going on top of the water, get the wings flapping, and eventually, when they get enough speed and get into the air, they'll rise up and begin their graceful flight. And it is graceful. You've got to really see this to appreciate the grace of the trumpeter swan. They're long live birds. The oldest bird known in the wild was a female over 26 years old. And that's a lot longer life than a lot of birds out there. In particular, the waterfowl world, it's a lot less than that usually. They're a wetland bird. They nest and forage in shallow wetlands. So that's critical. Wetlands are critical to the survival of trumpeter swans and critical to any restoration efforts that go on out there. We need a good wetland base to at least get some birds established, get some nesting going, and hopefully see increases. And they're named for that fabulous sound that they make, that trumpet-like sound. That's why I guess we use the word trumpeting the cause for wetland, but it's a beautiful sound to hear. And you put all those things together, and you got that large, charismatic megafauna that Joe Johnson referred to. Next slide. Well, here's some of the Iowa breeding habitat. The one there in the upper left, that's a couple swans there on a frozen marsh at this point, but the muskrat's houses are always there to loaf on and sometimes to nest on. So they provide important places for trumpeter swans to come into and kind of establish the possibility of nesting and raising young. They have to have that open expanse there, as you see in the next few slides, with some cattails in the background, just some beautiful pictures. Actually, they need that runway so they can kind of get momentum and take off and begin their flight. This is the site that we love to see in Iowa, where you got trumpeter swans right backed up against cattail vegetation, and then a nest site close by. Next, please. That's kind of a winter habitat. Obviously, a little snow would make you think it is probably winter. Again, you got the muskrat house, but they do arrive fairly early in the spring. There's snow around, although they need a little open water to get to as well. They need some open ground so they can forage if necessary in the uplands. They do feed on some of the residual corn that's left over from the harvest of previous fall, so that's a good food base for them. And they also feed sometimes on those shucks and other parts of the corn stalk itself. A nice little bundle of swans there in the bottom picture. Next slide. Okay, here's the trumpeter swan. Again, the largest North American waterfowl. They'll weigh up to again 35 pounds, although 20 or 25 to 30 is the biggest. They are just large, gigantic birds. There's a young there on the left with the neck collar, and probably the adult pair that belongs to that young next to over to the right. The tundra swan is somewhat smaller than the trumpeter. Maybe 20 pounds might be the maximum weight. But if you look in the diagram to the bottom here, you'll note that there is a yellow lure right there on the forepart of the eye. It looks like teardrop. And that's typical of the whistling or tundra swan. They used to be called whistling swans. They changed the name to tundra swans. They do make a more shrill sound than trumpeter, and that's where the whistling takes place. And then our old friend, the mute swan, he's not a native of North American continent. Many of the pioneers brought over mute swans when they come to the eastern shore of the U.S. And they're actually considered an exotic bird. They're sort of a nuisance now. If they establish, they tend to fend off a lot of other native waterfowl. We're not particularly excited about their presence. They make a little sound, even though it says mute, it's kind of a purring type sound. Next slide, please. Historically, they were widespread. As you see the large area that's colored there, that gray area, they were spread from Alaska to the north on down into Indiana and off over into Ohio. They went down through Iowa all the way to the northern third of Missouri. That's their nesting breeding area. The new white dots that you see there, those are dots that are currently in restoration efforts. And they get a little bit bigger and a little bit more frequent, so that's kind of a positive thing. Of course, we got a red spot there where we're doing our restoration efforts in Iowa. And then down the Mississippi River Valley to the Gulf Coast is where these swans formerly would migrate to, although their migration patterns that far south have slowed down a little bit. A lot of waterfowl are stopping further north. If there's water available and food available, they tend to not go quite that far south. In 1933, only 69 trumpeter swans remained in the continental U.S., and that was at the Red Rock Lake National Wildlife Refuge in Montana. And it became a National Wildlife Refuge because of the trumpeter swan. And note, too, in Iowa, of the 2 million acres of wetlands we had when the glacier receded, 98% of those have disappeared. So you have to kind of ponder a little bit, is it possible with that loss of wetlands to bring back the trumpeter swans? We're excited at the fact that they have adapted, and it is possible in some areas. Next slide. This sort of shows the last swan nesting in 1883. That's southeast of Clear Lake. Here, that's where I live. And anyway, that was a long time ago. It was 115 years. The skies were vacant of trumpeter swans. The wetlands were too. We began our efforts in 1992. We didn't get our first nest till 1998. So it was a long time, and it took some patience and some perseverance. But the swan came through for us, and we're really excited about what's taking place right now. Note sort of the wetland loss there. The white line that you see here on the diagram here, the lower left, it goes from about 3 million acres down to just about nothing. 98% of those wetlands have been lost. And again, I sort of ponder a little bit how these swans manage to adapt and get readjusted to that sort of thing. It's wonderful that they do, but it makes me nervous at times because I'd love to see more wetlands. And you can also see the population growth with the pink line. You kind of see where the cross section is. Iowa, when the glacier receded, was a wetland-rich state in the north part. When the farmers found out that that land underneath there was rich, fertile, it provided a wonderful base for them as they planted their crops. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Iowa started its Trumpeter Swan program restoration in 1992, 1993. We started with captive breeding, rearing, and releasing 1- and 2-year-old swans, released swans from other states, zoos, and rehabbers. And we did develop a number of private folks that wanted to have swans on their property. So they set up their property with a fence so they keep the swans on their wetland. They put an aeration system out there. They provided feed. And then the young that were produced there were actually part of the released birds that occurred. Our goal was to have a sustainable wildlife population so that we could have at least a good population year after year, and then to trumpet, to make as much noise as possible about the cause and the value for wetlands. Next slide. This slide just shows kind of the release of swans that begins sort of increased considerably around 2000. You see right there, we released a whole bunch of birds, 1,237 to be exact, at over 80 locations. And it really helped spread the wealth, so to speak, spread the excitement, spread the passion for people who wanted to see these large birds, and also to spread the passion for wetlands and how important that they are for swans and other birds. Next. First 4 swans released in 1994. The first modern day nest occurred over in the northeast part of the state in Dubuque County, somewhat unexpected, but a private propagator over there had some birds that flew free, and he got the first nest. And unexpected or not, we were excited that 1883, the last one nested historically, 1998, 115 years, the first one in the wild in Iowa occurred. Initially, our goal was 15 wild nesting pairs by 2003. We missed it by a little bit. 2004, we met that goal. We updated to 25 nesting pair by 2006, and we met that a little bit early in 2005. More recent goal, and this is in the southern part of the state, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later on, but we decided to expand our efforts a little bit to the south so the people down there could enjoy the fact that trumpeter swans could be in their area as well. And there's a lot of ponds and wetlands, and that goal was met. 8 nesting pair at this point in time. Next, please. The 1998 status, 1 nesting pair, and that is over there in the Jack Kennedy Farm Pond, northeast Iowa. Again, we were excited as could be that happened. But in 2020, it bounced up considerably, which really stirred the excitement to 119 nesting pairs. And during the January waterfowl count in the wintertime, during January, we had almost 4,000 trumpeter swans migrating through. And that's become a very important part, too, of the excitement associated with trumpeter swans. When people can see these things in the wintertime in larger groups, they can hear them, they can see that graceful flight they make. It stirred the excitement of a lot of folks. And this is just kind of an increase from the previous slide, but 15 additional nesting pairs. The cluster that you see in the northern part of the state there, north central part of the state, is the area where the most wetlands occur. When the glacier retreated, it dug out quite a few wetlands and became a wetland-rich part of Iowa. But when the farmers realized that there's some rich soil underneath, they started to drain those wetlands again to the point that 98% of the original wetlands have been drained. Next slide. People need wetlands, and they need them for a lot of reasons. If nothing else, just an escape from the mad rush of the everyday world. Get out there and kind of clear the wings, so to speak, clear the air, to get away from that cell phone or whatever else they happen to be kind of attached to in the rest of their life. But more importantly, water quality. Wetlands are Mother Nature's natural filters in that pollutants coming in at the upper part of the wetland as water runs into it, whether it be soil or whether it be actual other sort of pollutants, can easily be filtrated out by the vegetation as the wetland and the water drains to the lower part with the vegetation that's out there. And that's a wonderful aspect. Mother Nature's natural filters. Groundwater recharge, we need that, particularly during dry conditions. Flood control, they help slow down the water, so we don't have as much flooding in some areas, although we could obviously use a few more wetlands where the flooding is really great right now. Recreation, wonderful recreation opportunities, whether you're a consumptive user of the resource by a person that likes to harvest ducks or muskrats or geese or whatever, or whether you just enjoy going out there, viewing the wetlands, just breathing the fresh air that's out there and truly appreciating what's around you. And the aesthetics of wetlands, it's hard to describe, but they're beautiful in every sense of the word. Again, whether it be the cattails or whether it be the fauna that's on there. Wildlife needs habitat, and obviously wetlands is important for that. Food, important there too, wetland. Nesting areas, we talked about that with swans, but for other birds and for muskrats, for just a myriad of other species. Shelter and species diversity. In the wetland, there are probably more threatened and endangered species than in other types of habitat. Next. And I'm going to turn it over to Dave now, but he's going to cover some of that aspect.
Good morning. My name is Dave Hoffman with Iowa DNR. I've been active with Trumpeter Swan Restoration in Iowa since 1994. Pretty much just working with Ron there with the restoration, but I'm also been actively involved with the Trumpeter Swan Society and certainly encourage you to check the Trumpeter Swan Society out and all the great things they do there as well. Let me do the next slide there. So one thing unique about Iowa is our public engagement and trumpeting the cause for wetlands and all our public outreach. We've had over 500 public swan releases and events out there, from inviting the students out, as many as 1,000 kids, maybe 1,000 to 1,200 kids at some of the larger releases. Doing some of this trumpeter swan soirees, taking some of the swans into schools, and really getting the kids actively involved out there. So next slide, please. And so really the importance of connecting our youth with nature. I really like to tout the importance of that as well. And we'll go to the next slide. So really the importance to really engage those kids, engage where they get a connection with the habitat, with those birds, with the natural resources, and to really believe how that can empower our public. And with that instills an ownership. And then actually once there's an ownership is how we value. And what that then causes how we care for those particular things, respect, and ultimately we really protect what we value out there. Next, please. So some of the things we work with initially, we had the Trumpeter Swan and Wetland Education Manual for Iowa DNR, and through that was with the Iowa Wildlife Federation. But there's some new education and outreach materials out there, and I encourage you to check these out on the Trumpeter Swan Society website under Resources for Teachers. Here's a color and activity booklet from K to 2, and then also education and coloring activity booklets from grades 3 to 5. So here's a little more details, some things that can be found in some of those booklets, which talks about some of the releases and things people can be actively involved in as far as wetlands and trumpeter swans and such out there too. So next slide. So one thing we really try to do too is empower others. Here we have a picture on the left with a county conservation board naturalist, and provide resources for them too, for actually field days, for educational days, and where they can promote wetlands, trumpeter swans, and natural resources for us as well. Here on the right is our really active involvement with some of the zoos around the country. I think we had over 40 some zoos around the US actively involved. Here's we got Kansas City Zoo coming up with some of the swans they released and actually helping out tremendously with some of our educational programs. Here's a release down at Lake Icaria down in southern Iowa, and it's really great to see the people step up, volunteer, and actually help promote and educate and promote the trumpeters as well. Okay, next. So here's some, it's kind of interesting. We provided some real world data to some of our local schools, elementary schools and such. And here we provided just numbers. And what's kind of interesting, kind of neat is that it just gives those students and kids kind of a local connection. And they can use the real world data, the numbers, and actually use that in their educational. So it seems really, that's really quite interesting and quite neat to see these numbers being used by the students out there. Okay. So the other is the importance, what I found extremely rewarding is landowners creating swan habitat. This was over Northwest Iowa. We had a landowner show up at a public swan release. He's asking, well, how can I get these beautiful birds? How can I get these swans on my property? So we talked about some of the government programs out there, like the Wetland Reserve Program, the CREP. So he actually got enrolled in some of the public programs or the government programs, restored some wetlands on his property. And within 3 years, he had trumpeters on his wetlands. So I really encourage people with potential habitat to check out some of these programs and some of the things people can do to help restore wetlands out there and bring trumpeters to their area. Okay. So some of the threats to trumpeters, one thing is lead poisoning. Some of it shot, and some of that shot, it's really quite amazing. And we call it legacy lead. Like, for example, Pilot Knob State Park has been a park with no shot or no hunting over that for over 100 years, and how that shot remains down in the sediment. The trumpeters pick that up, especially on dry and drought years where they can reach more. So it's more problematic on low water levels or drought years, and they pick that shot up, or else sinkers too, and it's in their gizzard, and how they use that gizzard to grind up and digest their food. So the other part is kind of talk about is there's alternatives to some of this shot and sinkers. There's non-toxic alternatives out there, and we encourage people to check that out as well, some of the non-toxic alternatives. Some of the other is problems, threats, collisions with power lines. Some of the things we're doing is actually recording those in a database for power line strikes. With that database, as we kind of identify high strike areas, and then work with some of the power line companies to actually get some of those lines marked and hopefully ultimately reduce some of our collisions and mortalities out there. We also do have some illegal harvests going on out there. It seems like it has been reduced, but that's one thing we encourage early people too, is if you see somebody, a poacher, somebody that's harming or shooting a swan, is certainly report that to the local authorities. And we certainly want that to be reduced, their illegal harvest. Some of the other is continued habitat loss. We still see continued wetland drainage in Iowa, some of the pattern tiling, and it seems like even our sheet water used to last 5, 7, 10 days. It's typically drained and only around for a couple days. So we continue to lose habitat, but there is, to be positive too, there is some programs out there to restore habitat, and that's one thing is a DNR too, is trying to restore some wetland habitat out there for trumpeter swan habitat. But so some of the other threats is malnutrition here. Trumpeters, also some of the malnutrition is also with moldy bread or with aspergillosis. The asper is actually a mold in the air. Some of the other diseases is certainly like avian influenza. We haven't really seen any mortalities due to that, but we've had a few diseases here and there as well. We've had some degraded water quality. That's particularly due to carp. They stir up the water. We have a lot of nutrients in Iowa and a lot of runoff, and that nutrients in the water contributes to very high phosphorus and nitrogen levels in the water, and that creates to really a lot of plant growth that's unwanted or algae. And so we certainly have we could do much better on our water quality in the Midwest. We do have some issues with mute swans as well. They compete and they can actually alter our habitat and kind of stir up and muddy the water and destroy some of our plants. Okay. So here in Iowa, we have trumpeters, typically red or green collars. So we do encourage people to report those to the banding lab, to the Trumpeter Swan Society, Swan Watch, and to our Iowa DNR as well. Okay. So we've actually had over 800 swans collared. We have over 4,400 reports, and it's really interesting, kind of amazing to see how they've been distributed and migrated around the nation with 17 states reports and 3 provinces of Canada here so far. Okay. So here's a map with some of our nesting. Seems like typically swans, or Iowa swans, pioneer north. Typically, most of our nests are into southern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and we've had even some swans up into Ontario. I don't believe we had any nesting there as well. But then we have some spillovers to the east in Illinois and Missouri to the south with some of our swan nesting. Okay. So we did have a migration experiment with we cooperated with Trumpeter Swan Society and Iowa-Arkansas connection, a 3-year study. We had a goal of about 120 cygnets that were raised in captivity. We end up moving or had about 40 swans total. And what kind of our goal is to try to encourage southern migration, where we'd actually release some of these swans down in Arkansas in hopes that they would return to Iowa there as well. All right. So here's the release sites in Arkansas. Northern is the Buffalo National River, and then also Hollow Bend Wildlife Refuge there in Arkansas. So on the right there, we would actually have, these are Iowa swans and cygnets reared in Iowa. The goal is we'd have those cygnets fly or fledge in Iowa, imprint in Iowa, and then actually then released in Arkansas, where they would then hopefully return here to Iowa. Okay, next. So here's some pictures from Missouri or from Arkansas, some of the releases down there. So we'll go to the next one. So we had some mixed success. We had some swans from Arkansas that migrated up into Illinois, Iowa, and then actually returned back to Arkansas. We did have a couple of swans that migrated clear up into central Minnesota, and then were reported in Iowa, and then back down into Arkansas as well. Kind of the challenges we didn't have a whole lot of swans. They were collared, but not a whole lot of reports. There was a lot of swans, especially in the summer months. They just seemed like they disappeared and they weren't reported. And so we didn't really gather, we kind of missed some information too, where they were kind of hanging out there as well. Okay, next one. So Anna will take over here and
Great, thanks, Dave. My name is Anna Buckardt Thomas, and I'm the Avian Ecologist for the Iowa DNR. So I work with all of the non-game wildlife birds in the state. And I've been here about 5 years. And in that time, I've just joined this tail end of this really successful restoration program that Dave and Ron have stewarded. And so I've done a little bit of research on these populations. So I'm going to orient you here on the map. If you look on the right, kind of in the Midwest region, these blue states are considered the interior population of trumpeter swans. And so this population of trumpeter swans was completely extirpated from the area. It was extinct in this region. And it was completely reintroduced by different state programs to reintroduce those areas. And so now that population has continued to grow and is successfully established. And now over 40% of North America's trumpeter swans live in this interior population. And in the region, we're kind of interested in some certain research and conservation questions. So we want to understand more about their movements and habitat use. In the historical records, we knew that those trumpeter swans were very migratory, and they ended up down in the southern part of the Mississippi drainage and all the way onto the Gulf Coast. But we know that that's not really the case anymore. So understanding those movements, understanding habitat uses as landscapes continue to evolve, understanding how birds are surviving over different time periods in their life, the genetics of the population, and impacts of lead. And so a regional study was started by the Minnesota Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and they coordinated a GPS tracking study to get at some of these questions. And there were a number of states and provinces that participated. Those are listed there, and Iowa was one of them. And this study tracked over 100 trumpeter swans throughout that interior population. And so in Iowa, we were part of this study, and we really wanted to understand the movements and habitat use of our adult trumpeter swans. And so we did that by deploying 10 GPS units. That's a collar unit, like you see on the left there, on adult trumpeter swans in Iowa. And these are GPS GSM collars is what they're called. And so they're powered, they have a battery, but they're also solar charged. So that means that they can last pretty long. They collect a GPS location via satellite every 15 minutes. And because of that solar panel, the collars last for up to 3 years. Then every day, this is the GSM part of that name, they connect to the cellular network and send that GPS data basically to an online database where I can sit at my computer and look up where my birds are. And we get that data basically on the daily as long as they're within cell service. In addition, each of these collars has a unique ID. So you see the letter, for example, 4C. If someone were to come across this individual, they would know just by looking at it which bird it was that we tagged without having to recapture it. In addition to understanding this component of movement and ecology about the adults, we're also interested in learning about the cygnets, or the first-year trumpeter swans. So first-year trumpeter swans are called cygnets. They hatch in spring, stay with their parents until they fledge or they fly at the end of summer. They have this gray plumage that shifts to white over their first year of life, and they actually stay with their parents through the first winter. So they stay in these family groups. If their parents migrate during that winter, the cygnets migrate with them, and those parents don't kick them out or send them on their own until the next spring during their next breeding season. So about March the next year, they say, okay, it's time for us to raise a new brood, and they kick out those about 1-year-old birds. Then those cygnets become subadults, where they have adult plumage, but they're not yet breeding. And they typically breed for the first time somewhere between 3 and 4 years old. But sometimes birds don't breed until a little bit later in life, as long as 7 years. And so understanding this kind of first year of the life of cygnets was what we were focused on. And so in order to do that, we decided to take advantage of those GPS collared adults and track the whole family group. So we were able to mark the cygnets of adults that had a GPS collar. And each of those marked individuals got a green collar with a unique ID and a matching green leg band. And then because we were getting GPS fixes for those birds every day, we were able to find the family group every 2 weeks from, I think we started in September all the way up through March, to try to figure out and try to see which cygnets are still in the family group, and record those collar IDs and the location of the family to get an understanding of survival of the young. And so you might be wondering, how on earth do you catch a swan? The swan ecology is unique and really helpful in this case, is that the adults molt their wing feathers so that they're flightless during late summer, and the cygnets during late summer are large enough, they're full size, but they haven't started to fly yet. They're just learning to fly. And so we can find a sweet spot in Iowa sometime in the last half of August to the first half of September, where one of the adults is molting and can't fly. And when the cygnets are large enough to get to put a collar on, but are not yet flying either. And so we're able to track down these family groups by using a boat and some nets to capture them because they can't fly away. Once we capture the birds, we put a band on them. This is a silver band with a unique number that's given out by the U.S. Geological Survey's bird banding lab. We have permits to be able to do this work, to capture them and to put collars on them, for example. And that's all organized through the bird banding lab. So each individual, in addition to having this green collar with a unique number, they have a unique leg band, a silver leg band with a number that no other bird in the whole United States has. And so we're able to then track this individual through time. We determine the sex of the bird, we weigh the birds, take some body measurements, and then we also took a blood sample, and this contributed to that general region-wide interest in understanding the genetics of the population and understanding the impacts of lead. So in our first year, we were able to put GPS collars on 11 adults. We had 10 collars, but one adult died early in the season. And so we were able to really locate that GPS unit and redeploy it on a different individual. And so of those 11 birds, we had 91% survival with one death. And we determined that that was because of aspergillosis, which is that fungal disease that impacts the lungs of the bird. So in our first 2020 to 2021 wintering season, 4 families wintered in Iowa, 2 spent time in Missouri, 2 spent time in Kansas, and 1 family wintered along the Mississippi River on the Illinois-Missouri border. Here's a close-up of some of those GPS tracks of 3 of those individuals. Well, 4 actually. On the left is the 1 and 2. All of these family groups, these 4 family groups, stayed in Iowa all winter. And you can see at least 3 of those groups used the same overwintering area for roosting. And that is actually a quarry in fertile Iowa. And so this area, because it's an active quarry, has water that's artificially kept open all winter. And so a lot of the swans in the region were keying in on that and using that. And that's actually a site where we get hundreds of swans roosting in a given winter. We did have some birds, though, that did leave the state. And we could see that the temperature directly impacted the birds' movements. So in I think around February of 2021, there was one of those polar vortexes where it got really cold and it was -20 for about a week. And so the cold weather meant that all of the open water that was there, much of it closed up. So for example, rivers that were open closed up. And a lot of these birds reacted to those changes. So on the left-hand side here, the blue line, you can see there was a bird that was on the Mississippi River near Quincy, Illinois. During that time period, it moved south, farther down the river where it was more open water, presumably. In the green and purple one to the right, you can see that we had a bird that was really spending a lot of time near Des Moines in the Johnston area, at an open quarry site. That site froze during that time period, and that bird moved down to Missouri for the rest of the winter. This bird in the purple had been hanging out near Kansas City for much of the winter. During that freeze, it moved down to southern Kansas. And these birds on the right moved from inland parts of rivers to the Mississippi River when that cold snap happened. So overall, with our cygnet survival study and those green collars, we were able to put collars on 42 cygnets, and we found that there was a 78% overwinter survival in that year of 2020 to 2021. We know of 4 deaths. 2 of those happened because of a power line collision. During the time when the cygnets are just learning to fly, they're particularly susceptible to running into power lines because they're just learning to move and they don't know what a power line is yet. They haven't really spent much time out and about learning those things. And so they can be really, a really dangerous risk for them. We also had 1 died of illness and 1 was an unknown cause. But we did find that survival was related to family size. So in the graph on the right, on the x-axis, the horizontal axis on the bottom, is the number of cygnets the family had when we captured the family. And on the left axis, this phi term that's basically the probability of survival of an individual for a day. And so the more cygnets in your family, the more likely you are to survive. And so it was interesting that we don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but larger families had higher survival rates for those young. And then in the following year, once those birds were no longer with their parents and no longer with a GPS bird, we continued to get reports from the Trumpeter report, from the bird banding lab, and from our own reporting mechanisms on the DNR website. We were able to still get information on 21 individuals in that second winter. And so we know at least 21 of those individuals, about 50%, survived to that second winter. And we still get reports on many of those birds during migratory periods today. A few interesting stories that we found from this project was that cygnets typically disperse in the first week of March. So many of them stay with their parents all the way up to the point where the parents return to their breeding wetland in Iowa. And at that point, they say, okay, we're going to get ready to breed now. And they kick out the young and say, you're on your own. But some cygnets do disperse early. So we had at least one cygnet where we documented that the cygnet was alive, but it was no longer with the rest of its family on January 29th. So that's, a couple months earlier than that early March timeframe. And so it is possible that some of those birds disperse earlier. And then we also learned that fledged cygnets, fledging meaning the birds that can fly, those flying young may actually be adopted by other families. So if you look at the picture on the right here, this is a family group where when we captured the birds, the birds, this pair had 4 cygnets, and we were able to capture and put collars on 2 of those 4 cygnets. And so Dave went out to re-site these birds and get a count for survival purposes of how many cygnets were around. And he said, oh, look, all 4 cygnets are here. And they said, wait a second, we only put collars on 2 of these birds. And all of a sudden, there's a 3rd bird with a collar. And so he realized that this pair actually lost one of their uncollared cygnets. And this cygnet, with the arrow pointing at it, is a collared cygnet from a pair just a couple miles down the road. And so that pair must have been separated from this cygnet, and this cygnet flew around and decided, oh, look, I found some more swans, and it joined this family group. Dave watched this pair, and they were not very pleased with this new sibling around, and so they actually chased it off. But eventually, this bird ended up with a 3rd one of our marked family groups, and that group already had 7 cygnets, and this bird joined it and made it 8, and this bird stayed with that adopted family all winter long. And so that was a really unique scenario that we were able to observe because all these birds were marked. Like we said, many of these birds actually ended up outside of Iowa. And so we need to give a shout out to those folks in Missouri and Kansas, birders, folks from the zoo, folks from those state agencies who were able to keep track of those birds for us when they were out of the state during the winter. We were able to, get periodic information on those birds and really understand survival. And thanks to all these folks for making that possible. So this is fairly close to the end of our talk here, but just a few things that you can do for swans in your own life. If you see a swan with a collar, whether it's green or red or some other color or white, you can report that collar. All we need you to do is record the location of the swan, the date you had it, and the number and the color on that marker. And you can report it through the Trumpeter Swan Society's Trumpeter Watch. You can report it to reportban.gov through the USGS Bird Banding Lab, or if it's an Iowa swan, you can report through our website as well. You can also help us continue to learn more about how swans are impacted by power line strikes. So if you come across a bird or you see a bird either strike a power line or just narrowly avoid a power line, we like to keep records of those locations so that we can hope to work towards mitigating those risk areas and reducing that risk in the future. Same goes with lead. If you come across a sick bird or something where you suspect lead poisoning, feel free to reach out and to give us some more information for our records. And then you can support habitat. You can provide habitat on your own property if you have the space to do so. You can purchase a duck stamp, even if you're not a hunter, which goes towards wetland restoration and habitat management across the US. In Iowa, you can purchase a habitat stamp, which again works towards all habitats in Iowa, not just wetlands. But again, it's not limited just to hunting. You can have those stamps and they contribute to wildlife management in our state. And you can, of course, support the Trumpeter Swan Society as well in the work that they do. So I think we're going to leave it there and we'll open up the floor for questions. You won't be able to turn on your mic, but you can put your questions in the Q&A section of the site. And please remember, before we leave the Zoom today, that we'll have a survey pop up and we'd like for you to fill that out. So thanks so much for joining us.
Okay, thanks so much, Anna and Dave and Ron. So Jim, have any questions come in?
Yeah, we have a few questions and we have around 15 minutes. So I only have 3 or 4 questions. So if anybody has any, just type them in the Q&A box. We'll probably be able to get to pretty much all of them. So again, thanks to Anna and Dave and Ron for a great presentation. I have a comment from Mike Anderson saying it was a great story, and thanks for all you guys for what you've done for trumpeters and the people of Iowa. I think we all would echo that. There's a question from James about swan deaths, and he's wondering, of all the known swan deaths, would you have any idea what the percentage is due to power lines, and how that compares to the other sources of mortality? I think you may have addressed that, but anybody want to chime in on that?
Yep. I do have some numbers there. I can chime in. So I have down for lead poisoning, we have about 235 trumpeters we documented with lead poisoning. That's about 40%. 40% of our mortalities are lead. Next leading mortality is power lines with 203 trumpeters, power line strikes. That's about 33% of mortalities, power lines. We have about 14% illegal harvest, legal shootings. It does seem like that is reducing. We've got more education and awareness and in the hunter ed and some of the hunting regulation booklets. And it seemed like some of that before too, it was kind of known as kind of like a thrill kill. And swans are becoming more common. And it seems like some of the illegal shootings have, what we believe, has diminished. At 63 swans die with disease. That contributes about 9% of our swans and about 2% malnutrition. So if we got any more questions on that, but the other part is I forgot to add is with James there in Pocahontas County is appreciate all James has done in Pocahontas County Conservation Board, but really like to add what's unique in Iowa is all the volunteers out there. We had over 60 private propagators helping raise and rear trumpeters, just all the people that have jumped on the bandwagon and really volunteered to help out, from the zoos, the private people, from Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, all the great organizations. And, I really contributed that to Ron too, with his personality and really to get the people involved in engagement. And it seems like with that public support, engagement, and connection is how people have really stepped up and helped out and contributed to this really successful restoration here in Iowa.
Great, thanks. We
Dave,
have a
can
question.
I interrupt for just a second?
Go ahead.
David, what's behind the malnutrition? What causes that?
So some of that, it just seems, don't really have a good handle on it, but it just seems like some of the swans are underweight, or they could have, lack the aquatic vegetation, but it just seemed like the swans certainly didn't have the food, and they were just poor body shape, and then they were more likely for disease, aspergillosis, or they were just a little poor body condition too with the malnutrition.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Go ahead, Jim, sorry.
Okay, so, just a reminder, if you have a question, if you can type it in the Q&A, that's the best thing. I see there's at least one hand raised here, and I'm not sure we have it figured out how to give you access to the mic and stuff like that. So if you can type your question in the Q&A, that's the best thing. Mike Anderson is wondering if the brood size and hang on, I lost that for a second. Where'd that go? Oh, that was weird. He's wondering if the brood size and cygnet survival are related to the experience of the adults, and wondering if you have any information on that.
Yeah, so that was one of our theories as well, is that maybe older, more experienced adults have larger brood sizes, but we weren't able to quantify that because we don't know the age of those adults when we captured them. We just know that they're adults. So we don't have from our current data set, we don't have a direct answer to that one, but that's a good theory.
Okay. Here's a question from Jerry. How many trumpeter swans are in Iowa during the mating season, and how many there during the winter? What would the comparison
right
be?
now we have about 140 probably nesting pairs in the state. And then there's probably a handful of non-breeding individuals, those subadults as well. And then in the winter, we've got our midwinter waterfowl counts have been as high as about 5,000 birds that winter in the state from. So that's kind of the ballpark that we know of.
Okay. A question from Colleen. Is there any way to get rid of that legacy lead that Dave mentioned that's in the wetlands?
Yep, I could. It seems other states have tried it. It's really difficult and really expensive. There is actually some machines out there that are like tampers, and actually just kind of tamps and actually drives the lead kind of lower where the birds, the waterfowl, and the trumpeters can't reach it. There's actually been efforts where they kind of reclaim and they run kind of a sieve and ways to kind of but the part is so difficult, and it's such a large area. And we've done some studies in some of our wildlife areas where there's anywhere from 110 to 180,000 pellets per acre. So it's really quite common out there. And we do even see some die-offs, especially when we have drought years and where those swans get into an area that's a hot spot. And it's, really unfortunate. But again, some of the things we can do is encourage some of the non-toxic, some of the alternatives out there. And so we're actually then putting less lead out on our landscape. I think we estimate we still put about 5 to 6 ton of lead out on our Iowa landscape annually here.
Here's a question, another question, Colleen. Do we have beavers in Iowa, because they are also creators of ponds? So that's a good question.
Yeah, there are beaver in the state. In fact, one of my assignments was the fur bearer resource of the state. They are scattered, throughout the state, and they're a nuisance to the farmer. He just hates them because back in water on the cornfields and that sort of thing. But I don't know those beaver ponds where they're not conflicting with agriculture. They are nice for waterfowl, all waterfowl in general. I'm not aware of swans other than swans that have visited them that have actually done any nesting on them.
Okay. Here's a comment from Martha in Washington. Says it's good to see such a successful restoration of swans in Iowa, and thanks to Ron and Dave. It's rewarding to see that I guess the Washington Foster to Freedom program had helped restore many of those birds that you have in Iowa now. And she says she has a lot of fond memories of raising and sending the cygnets to you for so many years. So thanks for a great program from Martha. Thank you, Martha. Hey, here's a question from Bruce Conant in Alaska. Any thoughts about helping the trumpeters find some additional wintering habitat, for example, on the Gulf Coast?
Well, I might just comment real quick that when I was down in Arkansas, of course, I wanted to see the Arkansas connection work, but I thought to myself, it'd be neat if somewhere or other we could do some sort of a connection to the Gulf Coast as well, and then we'd have the complete swan history repeated. I don't know, with all the things that go on to the north now with more open water than there has been in the past, the birds just changing their way as far as not migrating for the south, if that's possible, but it would really be neat to try.
Great. There's a question from Keena in Ontario. And she wonders if for the swans that hit power lines, do you know how many of those have evidence of lead poisoning? So possibly that's something that's contributing to them hitting the power lines. Anybody want to tackle that one?
That's kind of a tough one, but we do test for lead, and it does seem like even some that die from disease like aspergillosis, and I don't really have any data on the swans hitting power lines, but it does seem like I would suspect they're more likely to get into trouble and have mortalities because the lead's going to impair their nervous system and such, and they're just kind of impaired. So I would certainly think the lead has some increased mortality on a number of trumpers and many types of mortalities out there.
Okay. A couple of questions from somebody. How long does it take for the cygnets to fledge? And the other thing is, when you capture them, what's it like? Or do they struggle, or do they seem stressed? Any of that?
So the cygnets in Iowa were typically, so the nests would hatch sometime in May or June, and the cygnets typically fledge late August, early September in Iowa. And in terms of capture, you know, when we're pursuing them in a boat, yes, they're feverishly trying to avoid us, and so they're flapping and swimming and trying to get away. But once we have them captured, we hold them basically in a big bear hug, and those swans are we're not stressing them out. As soon as we release them, they're back to their normal habitat and normal way of life and whatnot. So obviously being captured and abducted by human aliens is a bit of a stressful event for swans or any other animal, but we do it in a way that we're not doing any long-term damage to the individuals.
So you can see some of that in the upcoming film, Return of the Trumpeters. And that's one thing I've always been quite amazed on the trumpeters is how once they're restrained, a bear hug, how they just give up and how well they work to take in the schools. We took some in the nursing home, and just how well they work with the public releases. It's just really quite amazing how they just they don't really struggle. And so it's really quite a pleasure to work with them. They're just non-aggressive and really quite cooperative.
Okay. Here's a question from somebody who I'm getting a feeling lives in Michigan. They said they have a lake that previously had mute swans, and those mute swans had fledged over 50 cygnets in 10 years. And they're wondering if there's some place or someone who could give them some guidance on how to make their lake more attractive for trumpeters. Because they've seen some, but they haven't seen a lot of nesting pairs in their area.
I was wondering if they could talk to somebody at the Kellogg Bird Sanctuary there in Michigan is certainly one way, but certainly providing the habitat, you know, the food, the aquatic food and the plants. And we have the corny phrase in Iowa, build it and they will come. Certainly works, but it sounds like there's already the swan habitat there. So if the mutes are removed and such, it's really quite possible they could even draw in a number of trumpeters there into Michigan too. So
yeah, they did say previously had mute swans, so possibly those mute swans are no longer there.
Okay.
Yeah. A question from James. Do we have any idea what the percentage of swans that actually make it to breeding age, the percentage of young trumpeters that make it to breeding age in Iowa? You may have talked about that already.
That is one life stage that we haven't directly measured at this point in Iowa. So we measure the survival from hatching to, or we have in the past from hatching to fledging. And we did this survey about that first winter survival. Because those birds are not breeding yet, they could be anywhere. And so unless they're marked, and even if they are marked, it's really hard to know where they're going. And so we didn't personally put GPS collars on those cygnets. But some folks in that broader study did put GPS collars on cygnets and got some of that information about the first couple of years of their subadult life. But right now, our estimate of survival is based on inference from what we know about the other life stages. Dave, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we kind of had a really rough guess is that we lost nearly 75% of our cygnets before they reach the breeding age. And again, that was oftentimes 6 years old for a female, oftentimes 4 years for a male. So there is really some really quite high mortality. But the other part is how long they live and how they can actually then make up for it with reproduction, with their longevity up to, we mentioned earlier, 26 years. So yeah, we don't really have a good idea, but just a rough guess, and some pretty high mortality, but their population is, you can see they're doing quite well.
This
Great.
is Mark. I just want to interrupt a little bit again. And Carol Henderson is on, he's in the audience there, and so he might write into the question and answer. But I know when Carol and I have talked in the past, and he led the Minnesota DNR restoration program in the, outside the Twin Cities, and in their program, he had calculated about 25% of the cygnets actually reach breeding age after the 3 to 4 years. But Carol, you can correct me in the question and answer if I'm wrong about that.
Margaret, that's a great segue. We have one more comment, and it is from Carol Henderson, and he said, thanks, Ron and Dave and Anna, for a great presentation and the success you've had with the program there in Iowa. He says, FYI, I'll be putting in a small CREP. That's that program that was talked about in the presentation. A CREP wetland is farmland near Ziering. I guess that's in Minnesota this fall. And so he'd be willing to answer any questions about that, I guess, if anybody wants to get in touch with him. So
Yeah, actually,
ahead,
Ziering's
Ron.
in Iowa.
Oh, sorry. There you go.
No,
I didn't
he's the
realize.
property in Iowa.
There you go.
Ziering, Iowa.
I don't live anywhere near there, so I got that wrong. Anyways, that's really all we have. And Margaret, do you want to close
Well,
this
I do
off?
have one other
Okay.
question. So there might be people that might want to actually see some swans in the wintertime in Iowa. Dave, Ron, or Anna, can you identify any of the areas where, if they're coming down in the wintertime, where they might, be able to see some wintering trumpeter swans?
Some of the places I can identify in northern Iowa would be the fertile quarry north of Clear Lake. There's anywhere from 100 to 400 there. We have at Beamer's Pond, Hamilton County, near Webster City. There's a couple hundred that winter there, and over to Brushy Creek. We have down in the Des Moines area, there seems to be several hundred. And it seems like, especially with our mild winters, we're having quite a few swans in many counties. I think we had close to 30 or 40 counties out of 99, or over 40% of our counties had some type of trumpeter swan residing in those on our winter counts. So one way is to check like the Iowa birding site and some of the reports on that. Another is Unionslough National Wildlife Refuge has trumpeters. The Shilberg Quarry down in Atlantic typically has a number of swans down in Cass County. And so there's Cedar Rapids area, especially areas along the Mississippi, swans are really quite visible in many counties across the state here in Iowa anymore.
Great. Thanks so much. And I want to thank everyone for attending, and I want to thank our speakers today for your great presentation, and Jim for asking those questions. And hopefully we'll see you again another time. Thank you.